Imagine waking up in the world's most powerful country, only to realize that help will not come when you need it the most. In August 2005, Hurricane Katrina slammed into the Gulf Coast of the United States, destroying homes, cities, and lives. But the real disaster wasn't only the storm. It was what came after, the shocking failures of a government that promised protection, but delivered chaos. Over 1,800 people lost their lives. Entire neighborhoods drowned under filthy floodwaters. Tens of thousands of desperate survivors were left stranded, on rooftops, in hospitals, inside the Superdome, begging for food, water, and rescue. For days, the richest nation on earth looked powerless, or perhaps unwilling. Why did America fail so catastrophically? Why were the poorest and most vulnerable abandoned when they needed help most? And why do many call Katrina not just a natural disaster, but America's greatest failure? This is not just the story of a hurricane. This is the story of how a storm exposed the cracks in the foundation of a superpower. Hurricane Katrina began as a small tropical depression over the Bahamas in late August 2005. At first, it looked like just another storm in the busy Atlantic hurricane season. But within days, it transformed into a monster. Fueled by the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico, Katrina exploded into a Category 5 hurricane, one of the most powerful storms ever recorded in the United States. With winds reaching up to 175 miles per hour and a storm surge as high as 28 feet, Katrina carried the destructive force of a nuclear weapon spread across hundreds of miles. By the time it approached the Gulf Coast, meteorologists were issuing urgent warnings. This was no ordinary storm. This was a catastrophe in the making. New Orleans, a city built below sea level and protected only by an aging levee system, stood directly in Katrina's path. Officials knew the risks. Scientists had warned for years that one strong hurricane could drown the city, yet little had been done to prepare. On August 29, 2005, Katrina roared ashore. The world watched as the storm tore through Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Roofs were ripped off, highways were swallowed by water, and entire coastal communities disappeared overnight. But as devastating as the winds and waves were, the true nightmare was still to come. When the winds finally calmed and the storm moved inland, New Orleans was not saved. It was drowning. The levees, designed to protect the city, collapsed in more than 50 places. Walls of water poured into neighborhoods, swallowing entire blocks. Within hours, 80% of the city was underwater. More than 1,800 people would ultimately lose their lives. But the numbers alone cannot capture the horror. Families were trapped in attics as the water rose around them. Elderly residents in hospitals died when the power went out and ventilators stopped. Parents lifted their children onto rooftops, waving frantically for helicopters that never came. Tens of thousands of survivors sought refuge at the Louisiana Superdome and the city's convention center. What should have been safe havens turned into scenes of desperation. No electricity, no running water, food supplies running out. People waited in the sweltering heat, surrounded by filth and fear. Reports of crime, violence, and suffering spread across the world. Outside, bodies floated in the floodwaters for days. Streets once filled with music and life now echoed only with cries for help. For many, the cruelest part was not the storm itself, but the unbearable wait for rescue that never seemed to arrive. The images shocked the world. How could this happen in the richest country on earth? How could American citizens be left to die in their own city, abandoned on their rooftops and in their shelters? Katrina was no longer just a hurricane. It had become a national tragedy, a wound carved deep into the American conscience. The winds and floods were devastating, but what truly enraged the world was what happened next, America's response, or lack of it. Despite warnings days in advance, the evacuation of New Orleans was incomplete and chaotic. Tens of thousands of residents, mostly poor, elderly, or without cars, were left behind. They were told to get out, but never given the means to do so. When the storm hit, they had no choice but to face it head-on. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, was supposed to coordinate rescue and relief. Instead, it became a symbol of failure. Supplies were delayed, rescue missions mismanaged, and communication broke down. Trucks of water and food sat unused just miles away while survivors begged for help. The head of FEMA admitted he didn't even know desperate crowds were stranded at the convention center until reporters showed him live footage on television. The images sparked outrage. How could the United States government be so unprepared, so disorganized? Critics argued that the disaster response would have been faster and stronger if the victims had not been overwhelmingly poor and black. In New Orleans, nearly 70% of the population was African American, and they lived in the lowest-lying, most vulnerable neighborhoods. When the levees broke, it was these communities that were erased first. Media coverage fueled the controversy. Photos of white residents finding food contrasted with images of black residents looting stores, even when both were simply struggling to survive. This double standard exposed deep racial biases that had long existed beneath the surface. Meanwhile, rumors of violence, shootings, and riots in the Superdome spread like wildfire. Politicians repeated these stories, justifying a slower rescue out of fear. But many of these reports later turned out to be exaggerated or false. In reality, most people were not violent criminals. They were desperate survivors waiting for salvation that never came. Hurricane Katrina was not only a test of nature's power, it was a test of America's systems of government, equality, and justice. And in the eyes of millions, America failed that test. The storm eventually passed, but its scars remained. Hurricane Katrina left behind not just wreckage, but a reshaped America. More than 1 million people were displaced, the largest internal migration in the United States since the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Entire families abandoned New Orleans, some never to return. Whole neighborhoods became ghost towns, their homes rotting in floodwaters for months. Economically, Katrina caused over $125 billion in damages, making it the costliest natural disaster in U.S. history at that time. But beyond the numbers, the social toll was immeasurable. Jobs lost, schools destroyed, and communities torn apart. Tourism collapsed, businesses shuttered, and recovery dragged on for years. Politically, the storm changed America. Public trust in the government plummeted. President George W. Bush faced widespread criticism for his administration's slow and inadequate response. Images of stranded Americans begging for help became a permanent stain on his presidency. Culturally, Katrina reshaped the identity of New Orleans. The city, once famous for its music, culture, and resilience, had to fight for survival. And while New Orleans has rebuilt in many ways, scars of inequality and trauma remain visible to this day. Hurricane Katrina was not just a moment in time. It was a turning point, a disaster that forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about race, poverty, and the limits of its own power. Hurricane Katrina was more than a storm. It was a mirror, reflecting back the uncomfortable truths of America, that poverty, inequality, and government neglect can be just as deadly as wind and water. The hurricane exposed how fragile even the most powerful nation can be when its systems fail. It showed the world that strength is not measured only in military power or wealth, but in the ability to protect and care for its people when disaster strikes. For thousands of families, Katrina was the day they lost everything: homes, loved ones, communities, a sense of safety. For the nation, it was a day of reckoning, a reminder that greatness is not guaranteed, and that failure can come not from enemies abroad, but from within. So we ask, if another Katrina struck tomorrow, has America truly learned? Would the poor still be left behind? Would the response be faster, fairer, more humane? Hurricane Katrina will forever remain a chapter written in tragedy. But whether it stays a failure or becomes a lesson depends on what America chooses to do next.